Hi there. I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul, Inspirational Stories. Today I'd like to tell several stories about missionary miracles, things that happened on different people's missions throughout the years. The first story was contributed by Michael Nash, and his great-grandfather had quite a miraculous event, even though he lived his whole life not knowing what a miracle had taken place on his mission. Brother Nash's great-grandfather was Christian J. Larson. He was the 31st Danish convert to ever join the church. He was baptized by George P. Dykes in 1850 in Copenhagen, Denmark, and then was confirmed a member of the church by Erastus Snow. He was sent back to his hometown to preach the gospel. And the first day that his parents heard him preach, they were converted and were baptized that evening with his older sister. A few weeks later, Elder Larson was called with 6 other elders to serve in the Brevik mission in Norway. And when they arrived, they had only been there just a very short time when they were thrown in jail for the illegal practice of religion. Rather than be discouraged, they sang hymns of the restoration between themselves. And one day, a pastor, Carl Wittenborg, was walking by the jail, and he heard the songs the elders were singing and was touched by the Spirit. He went in to see who was singing these songs. He was very interested in their message. He listened carefully and then returned for more visits. His visits became more frequent and more focused, and eventually Carl Wittenberg joined the church. He had to be baptized by some of the members outside the jail, but afterwards he was confirmed a member of the church and given the priesthood by the elders in their jail cell. Upon his joining the church, he began to labor to get the missionaries out of jail. His efforts were fruitless for another 2 months, but he continued to work on getting the elders out. Meantime, the elders would preach to whoever would listen, people that were in the cells with them. The guards and the families of the guards heard them preaching. The people in the town heard them singing out of the jail. And one day, a young man, Johann Andreas Jensen, was tossed in jail with them as a religious dissident. And he frankly told the elders, "I don't believe your message. I don't want to hear it." But they continued to preach, and he didn't have a lot else to listen to. One day, as Elder Larson was testifying as to the truth of his message, Mr. Jensen felt the Spirit, and he began to ask the elders questions. And before long, they had a very strong divine influence between them as they spoke. And soon Mr. Jensen broke into tears, and he declared that he knew what they were saying was true. They were locked in that jail for 6.5 months. And finally, the old pastor succeeded in getting them out. But during that time, they didn't get discouraged. They didn't question the Lord and why he would lock them in the jail, why they were even on missions, and what good they could do. Instead, they just did what was there in front of them. Whatever they could do, that's what they did. During their time in jail, they converted the pastor, Carl Wittenborg. They converted 3 of the jailer's daughters, and they converted Johannes Andreas Jensen. After their release, Elder Larson decided that he would immigrate with the saints and go to Zion. And he joined one of the handcart companies and came out to the Great Basin. And he lived his life thinking that his mission had not been very important. And he didn't really know what he had done. He had converted a local pastor. He'd converted 3 good women and 1 young religious dissident, Johannes Andreas Jensen. After Brother Jensen was baptized, he also immigrated to the United States, and one of his daughters married Andrew C. Nelson, whose grandson, Russell M. Nelson, is now the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The next story I want to share is from G. Lee Ellison of South Carolina. And during the 1980s, he lived in Salt Lake City, and he owned a condo just off 4500 South, just south of the city, and decided to rent one of his rooms to a friend. His friend's family had moved from the Netherlands earlier, and his friend had joined the church and served a mission, even though his parents had never become members of the church. And Lee said he was helping his friend move in. They were arranging furniture, and his friend hung a small picture on the wall. It was a 5x7 framed sketch. As he looked at it, he realized it was a pencil drawing of his friend, because he had the same signature wire-rimmed glasses and curly hair that his friend had. So he asked him about it, and his friend told him an amazing story. He said he was in the Netherlands on his mission, and one day as the two missionaries were concluding their work for the day, they were starting to go home, and they saw one door, and they decided they'd knock on one last door. And it always seems to be the last door that these miracles take place at. And this man answered the door. When he opened the door, his eyes got big, and he stared at the elder. He turned and he ran back into the house, and he was gone for a while. And the elders didn't know what to do. They sat there with their mouths and the doors wide open, and they just waited. And soon the man came back. He invited the missionaries in, and they sat down and began to share their message with him. And he blatantly stared just in unbelief at this one elder. And finally he reached to his side, and he handed them a sketch, the same sketch that was now framed on Brother Ellison's wall in his condo. And then he explained what the sketch meant. He said a few weeks earlier he was awakened right after dreaming a very unusual dream. After the dream, he rolled out of bed, he grabbed his artist sketch pad, and he drew in very specific detail the face that was burned into his mind. And now he, just a few weeks later, was astonished to be sitting in front of the individual that he had drawn. He was sitting in his home, and he nervously pled with the missionaries, "Please, what is your message?" Well, as they say, the rest is history. He joined the church, and he was a strong member of the congregation in the Netherlands after that. The next story, we're going to have to go back in time to 1856. Amasa Potter was called to serve in the Australian mission, and he felt very inadequate. He couldn't read or write, and he told President Heber C. Kimball that he thought it would be better if he stayed home and got some schooling before he left. And President Kimball prophesied to him when he expressed his concern. He said, "Many great and important things will happen to you in the next 3 years. Death will stare you in the face. But if you remain faithful to your mission, the angels of God will deliver you from your trials, and you will return safely home." And then he added that if he would serve faithfully, he would learn to read and write through a close application of the Holy Spirit. Elder Potter, along with several other missionaries, made their way to San Francisco, and then they booked a passage on the Chelsea to sail 10,000 miles, and they arrived in Sydney 36 days later. Upon their arrival, they soon determined that there was great opposition to the church in Sydney, and everywhere they went, it seemed that everything was closed to them, and they met huge resistance everywhere. And they decided that they would go to Camden, Australia. And as they traveled, all the public houses were closed to them, and the elders were spared from violent outcomes several times by divine intervention. They soon determined that the places where they got the most resistance and the cruelest treatment, if they would persevere, they would soon have people that would listen to them, they would baptize people, and they would establish branches of the church. And this happened in town after town. And soon these elders began to boldly declare the Word of God wherever they were. and they decided that they would go to Picton. They found a large hall and determined to have a big meeting there. They found the judge that was in charge of that building, and they reserved it for Friday night. And then they posted notices all around town about their meeting. And the rest of the week, Elder Potter's senior companion studied endlessly, marking scriptures in the Bible and practicing phrases and things that he would say. And the night of the meeting came, and there was a huge group in this hall. It was filled, and Elder Potter's companion got up. He called the meeting to order. They tried to sing a song, but the people seemed to have kind of a negative attitude towards him. So Elder Potter's companion began to talk, and he preached for 5 minutes, then abruptly ended and said, "We will now listen to Elder Potter, and he will preach to us till the close of the meeting." And Elder Potter was shocked. He had not received any advance notice. He'd never spoken at a pulpit or to a large group in his life. And he walked up to the pulpit, and there was a big, large Bible there, and it opened up to Amos, and he read the scripture, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants the prophets." And then he spoke for a few moments about that verse, and then his mind went blank. And he stood there looking at this crowd for 2 minutes. He didn't have a word come to his head. And suddenly, on the back wall of the hall, large letters began to appear. And Elder Potter began to read these letters as he spoke to the crowd. And he spoke for over an hour. And at the end, he concluded with a powerful testimony. And afterwards, his companion told him he had done an excellent job. It was a powerful sermon. And then the judge came up to him and shook his hand and said, "Anytime you want to use this hall, boys, you're welcome to it." And so they booked the hall for the following Friday. They had a meeting that Friday, and not a soul came. They had a meeting the following Friday, and again, no one came. And the elders soon learned that the priests and the pastors in that town were preventing anyone from coming to their meetings. So they were trying to decide what to do, and they got a letter from the Emu Plains, and some people that had heard the sermon that had been read off the back of the wall of this meeting house asked them to come preach to them in their town. And they were about 60 miles away. The elders packed up their gear and they prepared to leave, but it had been raining for quite a while, and they just went ahead and left in the rain. And as they walked, they learned that the bridge over the huge river they had to cross had been washed away by these heavy rains. But there was a ferry that would take them across for 5 crowns, but they didn't have a penny to their name. So as they walked, they discussed what they should do. They were out in the country approaching this river, and they finally decided they would go out in the woods and pray. They knelt down and offered a sincere prayer that the Lord might soften someone's heart to provide them with the funds that they needed to get passage on this ferry. Then they returned to the road and started walking. And soon they saw an old man coming across a field, and he came onto the road and walked towards them, had a pleasant smile on his face, and he reached out and he shook the elders' hands, and as they brought their hand back, there was a 5-crown piece in each hand. And he didn't say a word. They didn't talk to him. The elders said that they felt their hearts burn within them as they watched this man and as he shook their hand. It was a quiet encounter. No one spoke. No one asked each other's names. And yet, as they brought their hand back, there was the money they needed to cross that river. They said the man was about 6 feet tall. He wore gray clothes, and he had a white beard and white hair. And after he disappeared, they both felt a gentle assurance that the Lord had sent a heavenly messenger to provide them with the money they needed for their passage. The next story I want to share is from 1852. Elder James S. Brown was called to serve in Tahiti, and he had converted several people in a small village, And one day, a council of the natives in the village decided to have a council at the local schoolhouse and determine a solution to the problem with the Latter-day Saint people that were seeming to take over their village. As the afternoon progressed, they had several young braves that were with them that were very agitated. And the mob continued to grow, and they moved their meeting from the schoolhouse to the little native home where Elder Brown and his little flock had congregated, because they could feel the tension rising in this village. The men surrounded the home, and they began to tear down the fence, and they dug a big pit and decided they were going to roast a pig. And so they dug this pit, they put the pig in there, and then they began to build a huge fire. And they heaped wood on that fire all night. And as the fervor of this mob grew, they started to chant, "We're going to have a fat young missionary roast tomorrow." And they got more excited and more excited. They brought more wood in. They had a huge fire going all night long, and no one slept inside the house. The members were gathered together. They sang hymns. They bore their testimonies to one another and tried to reassure each other that the Lord did love them and was watching over them. But the threats of the mob made it very difficult to feel comfortable. The huge blaze was fed all night, and the pig was roasted, and in the morning word had spread, and more people from surrounding areas came to participate in the feast. And as the feast began, 3 young braves came busting into the house, and they walked towards Elder Brown. They had a huge plate of pig meat, and they said, "We want you to eat all of this because we want you to be nice and fat when we roast you later." And everyone was worried because the mob was getting huge and they seemed to have violent intentions. And finally, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, these 3 braves came back in and they said, "We have been told by the council to drag you out to the fire." And Elder Brown looked at them, and the promises that President Brigham Young and Elder Willard Richards had made to him echoed in his mind. They had both told him that he would return safely to the saints. And without hesitation, he says, he walked out towards the assembly. There were 12 or 15 of these muscular, strong Tahitians, and they were stripped down to just a loincloth, and they'd oiled their bodies. They had their arms crossed defiantly in front of their chests. And then there were about 25 older men from the area that seemed to be a little wiser in their approach, but they were also very agitated. And one of the older leaders, Tabate, stepped forward, and he said, "All of the Mormons step over here on the left with the goats, and everyone else step over here with the sheep on the right." And then at that moment, a young convert, Ravae, and his wife stepped forward. And Ravae looked at this mob defiantly. He said, "If you burn this man, you will have to burn me first." And then his wife stepped forward with an 8-month-old baby in her arms and said, "You will have to burn me, and you will have to burn my baby, because we are Mormons, and if you don't burn us, Mormonism will grow again." And Tabate, the leader, was angry, and he responded. He said, "Look at this huge fire. This will consume the flesh off your bones so quickly there'll be no trace of you." At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord rested mightily on Elder Brown. He said he felt like he could push right through the entire mob and leap over the house. And then he said defiantly, "In the name of Israel's God, I defy your 10 best men or all of you. I serve that God who delivered Daniel from the fiery furnace." Elder Brown later said that there was not a particle of fear or tremor in his whole body. At that moment, a spirit of division infested the mob, and the young braves turned on the elder tribesmen, and they began to have a violent fight. They were using clubs and stones, and the fight went on into the afternoon, and all of a sudden, as evening came, it stopped. They all left, and the little Mormon group was left in peace. They were amazed at what had happened, but the crowd had left. And for the next few weeks, there was a feeling of peace and security to everyone in the village. One day, Elder Brown was walking down a jungle path, and one of the senior members of the mob came face to face with him on this trail. And the guy turned and just booked off the other direction and ran away. And Elder Brown chased him down and grabbed a hold of him, and he said, "Why did you run?" And the man said, "Your God is a God of power, and I'm afraid to meet his servant." He then explained that at the moment Elder Brown had defied the mob, a brilliant light or pillar of fire surrounded him. He said it was as bright as the sun. And then he further explained that the young braves had not seen the light, only the elder tribesmen, and the young men were demanding that they burn Elder Brown, and the older men refused, and that's what caused the battle. And then he said, "We know you are a true servant of the true God." One last story that's more modern took place in 1970 with Elder Bob Myers. He was called to central Brazil at a time when there was a border dispute between Brazil and Bolivia, and communist insurgents were trying to take over the southern part of Brazil, and there was a lot of contention. And the Brazilian population was really violently opposed to a communist takeover. And privately, members of the police and members of the military organized into junta military groups that were actively anti-communist. At the time, they were known as death squads, and they were known to carry out off-book executions of people that they suspected of being communists and of providing safe haven for communists. The police in the more populated areas, like the cities and the major towns, provided protection for everyone. But out in the country, these death squads were known to kind of rule. And one evening, Elder Myers and his senior companion, Elder Christofferson, were given a mission referral, which means they got an address and a name that had come to the mission office, and they were sent out to find this referral and to teach them the gospel. They had to leave Sao Paulo and drive way out into the countryside, and so the mission provided them one of the missionary cars. It was a big Suburban to drive out there, and they drove, and it was getting dark, and soon they realized they didn't know for sure where this place was. They were driving down this country road, and it was dark, and they realized they were in the wrong part of the country, and so they decided they better turn around. And off to the side of the road, they noticed some lights down off the road and a little trail leading down there. Thought, well, this is a good place to turn this long rig around. So they drove down there, and they thought, well, there's people down there. We'll go talk to them and find out if they know where this address is. And so they drove down, and then as they came through piles of garbage, because it was one of those unofficial fields that everybody dumps their refuse in, and they came around one big pile, and there in front of them were several men holding pistols and automatic weapons. And before they could do a thing about it, two of the men came running towards their car, and so they stopped, and they demanded that the elders get out of their car. The elders got out. They had their badges and their jackets on. They tried to talk to the men. Elder Myers didn't speak very good Portuguese. Elder Christofferson tried his best to explain who they were, and two of the men grabbed him and began to drag Elder Christofferson out into the jungle, both of them with their weapons slung over their shoulder. And Elder Christofferson turned and said, "Elder, we've stumbled onto a death squad. Keep your mouth shut." And Elder Myers did his best. He had two men standing with weapons right in front of him, and he tried to explain to them that he was an American, that he was a missionary, that he was a minister for Jesus Christ, and he didn't speak very good Portuguese, and they just were looking at him blankly, and he thought for sure they were going to kill them both. And as he tried to explain to him, he said it just seemed like forever. And finally, Elder Christofferson came trotting back out of the jungle, and he ran towards his vehicle, and he yelled to his companion, "Elder Myers, get in the truck, get in the truck." He says, "We got to get out of here. They told us to turn around and never look back." But that night, out in the countryside of Brazil, those two missionaries were protected. They may not have had a pillar of light or a ring of fire around them, but they were on the Lord's errand, and they were protected from that violence. I appreciate everyone that shared stories with me. Next week, I'm going to share stories that some of the listeners have shared about temple experiences and miracles in their life. And I would encourage anyone that would like to share an inspirational story to please reach out to me, and I'll give you my email address. I usually post it right in the first comment after each episode, so you're welcome to email me a story that you'd like shared. We all need more inspiration. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, don't be discouraged. The Lord loves you. If you doubt that, stop and think about it. Push those negative thoughts out of your mind, and then kneel down and verbally ask the Lord, do you love me? And I promise you, if you will do that with a sincere heart, you will feel the Lord's love pour into your heart and into your mind, and you will know that God is on our right hand. He's on our left hand, and he goes before us to prepare the way for us to return to his presence. I hope you've enjoyed these stories today. I appreciate everyone that shared stories with us. You can subscribe here, and if you enjoyed this story, you'd probably enjoy this one. You can listen to all of Brother Merrill's stories right here. Thank you.